Not yet. Not yet. Drawing! One of the most wonderful things that humans can do. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about drawing, specifically drawing representationally from life. There's so many types of drawing, and it does not have to be drawing representationally from life, but it's a good place to start. I'm by no means a super realist when I draw or paint. It's still useful for me and for anyone to practice observing from life and breaking those things down into how they inspire you to create and into the actual fundamental elements that will help you create the illusion of space to create that 3D in-life representation on a 2D surface. So it can be a little daunting. And if you're one of those people that's like, oh, I don't want to draw, I can't even draw a straight line. I can't draw a straight line. Psh, I'm not a ruler person. Psh, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It's great. Of course, it's great if you are somebody that has the super fine motor skills that can be very precise. Some of us are different types of artists. Sometimes they're a little sketchier like me, like a little wiggly about it. And that's totally fine. There's so many different ways to create marks that are beautiful. So much is playing around, happy accidents, and learning what your hand is willing to do. But also, so much of it is learning how to look and how to perceive the world around you in terms of certain ways you can translate what you see with your mind's eye into art. So I wanted to break down some of the things that are really pretty fundamental and helpful when observing something that you want to represent in a drawing from life. In order to do that, I had to find something to draw that we could break down the process together. I kind of looked around, interviewed some of my housemates. Purple ball face, a little too simple. Skeletoni, I think, was too complicated to unleash just yet. Kit Kat, my old trusty pal, been there for me since early on. Always a good friend, but some people find her a little disconcerting.
You're going to get on my face.
Hilda, but she wouldn't take off her mask. The noseless gnome was way too fidgety. Ron was always pretty drunk. Sally Sue was too busy being the cool kid in the hallway. Count her out. And then there was Sarah. Wiggles a lot and needs a lot of snack breaks. But I'm always for snack breaks too. So Sarah volunteered, and we were all ready to start a lesson in drawing. A conceptual lesson, not step by step necessarily, but just the ideas that you want to rotate through when you're starting to observe an object that you are planning on practicing representing through drawing. So, go back to your basic shapes. So in art, there's line, there's shape, which is a two-dimensional closed line, and they can be organic little blob scribbles that you make enclosed, or they can be the shapes that we know, square, triangle, circle. Those are shapes, and they're two-dimensional. A form in art is any three-dimensional shape in space. It can be organic, like a head, or any sort of blob, but it can also be a sphere, it can be a cone. Somewhere along the way in life, you probably have learned the simplest way to represent basic shapes using line, and with that line, create the illusion of form through simple representation of perspective. So here we create a cube, a sphere, a cylinder, and a cone. These are also amazing representations of my ability to draw quality straight lines and perfect circles. One of the ways you can start, if you have no idea how to break down a more complex object that you're trying to draw, it can be helpful to imagine how those forms could be cut in half. You could cut the top off a cone, you could turn them sideways, we can stretch them, squash them down, creating rectangle boxes, slices of spheres. If we start to think about all the different ways that we can manipulate them, then we can start to break down a more complex form, such as the beautiful Sarah, into super basic 3D shapes that we're representing with line. As if you had blocks and you were putting them together to make the abstracted block version of this dinosaur. I drew a little light here, so I drew over it afterwards to represent what shapes I was thinking. We can break them down however we understand them best. There's no right or wrong way. This is just an exercise in your mind to help you start to get less intimidated by something that seems complex and you're like, there's things coming out and you just got pokey things and I don't know what to do with this. Just calm down, Just let's take it all together with these basic shapes. She's got a big wonderful sphere booty. She's got some kind of half spheres stuck on there and a cone tail, a sideways cut body. These are oversimplifications, but that's okay. If you don't automatically do this, you might get in the habit of doing, kind of looking at something and being like, how would I build that in imaginary 3D shapes? Beep. Organic forms are not that simple. They're made of like a box with two spheres. One of the ways you can approach thinking about the more complex forms that are not going to just be a basic box is almost sculpturally in your mind, imagining how it would be to shave off parts to create more faces on the form. In the areas that are a little more complex, like Sarah's face, I put a squashed cube towards the back there with a partial sphere on the end for her nose, connected with a partial cone, as in various cones for her horn, the spherical cheek. But if we look at how much more complex it is that her eye is actually set in, we start to realize how this creates more surface faces on the form than would exist in our basic 3D building block shapes. We inherently know this, but a way we can start thinking about this in terms of art is by mentally carving more faces into these 3D shapes. I did multiple examples. No two times were they exactly the same. That's completely fine. We're just trying to explore understanding forms. If we take a simple cone, thinking about if it actually were broken down into planes around a curve, this can be helpful for us to picture because it brings us to thinking about how light hits surface faces of three-dimensional shapes. But in order to talk about light and dark, we need to be introduced to the concept of value, which is essentially the light to dark scale in artwork. So we're going to pause this cone and we're going to step back and I'm going to talk a little bit about value. Value is the most important thing when creating the illusion of form in representational art. Everything that we see is essentially just our brains interpreting light, and the range of value is how dark something is to how light something is. We understand just from existing in our world that something has form because of how light hits it. If you're trying to create the illusion of form, light is everything. Value scales. I just did some examples here to show the range. For creating a value scale, you can start with the darkest dark that your medium can create. And then I tend to go to the middle, kind of create what I think is 50% between the darkest dark and the white of the paper. And then I fill them in kind of a gradient. It's really just getting familiar with your medium and seeing what it can create. Here is our one in charcoal, one in graphite. You have something like pen. The different mark making has different terms. There's hatching, there's cross-hatching, there's stippling or blob dotting, random marks, dense marks, creating darker value, and then thinner and more dispersed as you go lighter on the value scale. This is just a little example. We're not going to talk too much about color. This time it's complex and beautiful and wonderful, but we are in general looking at the world in color. So practicing how different colors also can be thought of as a value, it can be a little tough. It can take some practice. Here, we'll take the primaries, red, yellow, and blue, and if we make them grayscale, just as an example, you can see that yellow has the lightest value, red will be somewhere in the middle, and blue will have the darkest value of those primaries. If you have something that you're confused about the value of, take a picture and make it grayscale just to see. It's not that serious. It's really good to practice from light. Random tangent, it's always important to play around and make marks with whatever you're going to be drawing with. If it's a medium that you're really familiar with, that's great, but it's still good and useful to have expressive exercises where you're just fiddling, you're just seeing what line quality you can create. Line quality not being good or bad, but being the difference in width and the difference in stroke. It's assessing the different ways that you can make marks. So that's why I just played around real quick with my charcoal and my blending stump and my wonderful kneaded eraser, seeing what marks that I can make. Do this all the time. Do it with whatever. Scribble all over everything. Everything you own should have scribbles on it. I just wanted to break down value with a pretty simple shape. It's a shiny egg that Sarah laid for us. And I'm just trying to not think about, oh, that's an egg. We're trying to just approach it as what values do I see? Because if you assess the area that you're trying to represent and you start to create those values and best you can match them, the form is going to emerge. You'll have a light source. The light source is going to illuminate basically the light side of whatever object that you have. Form shadow is the shadow on the form. The cast shadow is the shadow that is actually being cast. The light side can be broken down into a highlight, then some gradient of light middle tones that are going towards the shadow side, where you will encounter the core shadow, the darkest part of that curve, right on the edge of where it's actually turning away from the light source. The reflected light, which is a little stronger in this drawing because this egg is shiny, and there's other dark middle tones throughout there. In the cast shadow, there can be varying values. The occlusion shadow is closest to the object where it's blocking all of the light, and then there's going to be different values of shadow getting lighter as you get further away from the object. These are absolutely not terms you need to know, but If you're someone that thinks about things more in terms of the sculptural idea, that it exists, you like the idea it's made of these building blocks, it might be helpful to start to think about shadow in terms of breaking forms down into the planes and actually looking and seeing where the light hits, and know if the value changes, it's because the light hits at a different angle. Or you can think about the value as the shadow shapes that you see, the changes in value that you see, and organically, as you start to represent and trace out those, form will emerge, because really all we're seeing is a range of light to shadow. And we know from experiencing our world that that means a certain type of 3D form, because we're so used to that. And starting to pay attention to that in art is how we can have forms emerge from just looking at the value. I think now we're ready to do an exercise back on Sarah where we're just thinking about the value, and you're not really thinking about the line, you're not really thinking ahead as if it's building blocks, you're just looking at value. And as you try to replicate what you see in terms of these shapes of shadow, a form will emerge, because that's how we see things. We essentially see differing value, and that our brain interprets these 3D objects that the light is reflecting off of. I don't have it mastered. I am so into contrast that I exaggerate values all the time, and I do it not throughout the whole thing. I'll do it locally so that I'll see a highlight, a little highlight, and I'll be like, oh yay, it's super white, but it's so much darker than the highlight that's at a different point in the drawing. I tend to have that issue. So I start a lot with the side of the charcoal to kind of avoid using a lot of line, and start with these abstracted shapes of shadow that I'm seeing. I cheat a little bit because it is hard to not start to create some line around edge. With a more complex form made up of all these different smaller forms, depending on how far you break it down, you'll have form shadows, let's say on the horn, and then it'll cast its own cast shadow onto the head, and that will also become part of the form shadow of the head. So you're having to think about a lot of layers. It's really awesome to see the complexity of shadow that light creates. If you were to open your eyes for the first time and see something that you had no idea what you're looking at, but you were able to just focus on what values you see next to each other and were able to draw those values, that form would come out of your paper. You would have represented it, because value is essentially all we're seeing. It can be super helpful if you think in different terms, more like building blocks, to go about dissecting Sarah in terms of those bigger shapes. But value is really where you're going to get the illusion of form. One of the things that's also important is to start general and get specific. With the head, for example, which is a little bit more complex, it's really easy to get excited about one little part, like, ooh, the eye. I'm just gonna sit there and render the eye very closely. And you start to ignore the overall value balance. It's good to start with the general, larger shadow shapes, and then you can break them down into their sub-shadow shapes, where they're darker, where there's more texture that you can see. General to the specific. Line is also just wonderful and super important. So a fun way to engage with and explore line is doing a contour line drawing. This is where you essentially are trying to represent the form you see with line, going around the outside, trying not to pick up your pen as much as possible. It's going to abstract the form somewhat and can give you insight into movement of the shapes, and help us really appreciate some of the contours and some of the oddity and strangeness that might happen when we create. Line is so important to expression and movement. Contour line drawings are meant to be exploratory of how you observe, how your hand moves, how you translate your perception of a form into the line growing into a shape on a 2D surface. So right now, we've thought about what basic forms make up our full organic form that is our beautiful dinosaur. Don't be modest. Of course Jack would have chosen to draw you if you'd been there. More beautiful than all of his French girls. Yeah, absolutely. You're beautiful. We've thought about basic forms, and we're keeping that in our mind and thinking about how the light and the shadow make up everything we're seeing about this form. So we've come at it from the idea of value. And then we've thought a little bit about line to help us start to appreciate some of the contours and the shape and those kind of interesting things. For me, when I'm thinking about a drawing, I tend to approach it thinking about the shadow shapes that the value is creating and using line, because I find line so fun to emphasize those and then fill them in with whatever texture. That's just the way I've been interested in drawing recently, but it can change up and it can rotate. I think about having those forms emerge through the value, but when I started talking at the beginning about breaking things that we're looking at down into those simple forms that we can understand, that is a really good place to start if you are not used to looking at the world around you in the way that things can be broken down to draw. We're going for representing something from life and trying to create an illusion of form, relatively in realism, but it's more about recognizing how we want to interpret those things than having to make sure it looks exactly alike. Most of my sketches and most of my drawings from life, I even start in a pen just because I like the history of the drawing, and I go really lightly and try to get the general overall gesture in there. A gesture being the quick capture of the movement and the generalized layout. We'll talk more about those at a different video. Just getting in the general shape slightly. I start lightly pulling out some of the shadow shapes that I'm going to follow. I do almost topographical shadow shape marks. I chose to do something that's like deliciously tedious. That wonderful, agitating, yet fulfilling feeling of doing something super tiny that's gonna grow. I start to create my shadow using the texture, similar to the random marks, the stippling when we looked at the value scale, but I'm trying to imply some of her texture that's on the fabric. When I'm drawing the areas with line around a part that's highlighted, that's where you use very, very little thin line, where your line quality is very, very light, very thin. And then in the darker shadow parts, you get thicker with your lines. You have more weight to them. Where things are grounded, you use a weightier line. I'm trying to work across the thing and keep the larger shadow shapes going, but due to the pen being such a slow medium, I tend to have it grow as I go, so I don't necessarily follow my own advice. I do kind of tend to tighten up more than I like when I'm trying to create a level of likeness that can sometimes hinder the movement in my drawings, but this is all right. So the shadow shapes are growing pretty slowly, but I've committed to this. One of my issues that I have when I'm drawing and I'm thinking about value is that I tend to exaggerate the contrast locally in various parts of the drawing instead of paying attention to it as a whole. I get excited about the highlight and maybe that becomes super white, even though if you really took a look at how Sarah is lit, the front of her face is not quite like glowing bright as I've made it here. See, if you're anything like me, you're like, yes, I found the dark part of the shadow. And then you see a highlight at the reflected light and you're like, yeah, but the reflected light is never going to be as bright as the highlight, and I sometimes leave it as white as the paper because I go crazy. I go crazy for reflected light. It's just, whoo. The reflected light of a back foot is obviously going to be pretty dark where you can barely see it, but I'll still let it be. It can take away from creating an overall space. It's something that it's good for me to try to fight against, just to see that I can, or to know when it's better to stay away from some of my stylistic amped up local contrast. One thing that I did not do here while I was sketching out the general layout was I did not check for proportion. There's a trick when drawing from life and you're trying to get something close to the proportion that you're actually seeing. You stand with your arms straight out, holding your pencil or pen, and you keep your arm fully straight with your shoulder in the same position in the plane with your body. You close one eye and you always make sure it's the same eye. Within your object or within your visual picture plane, you measure 2 points between anywhere on your drawing. Then you can use that as a unit of measurement to judge the ratio of the other parts of your drawing. I could do either the leg or I could do between the horns as one unit. And if I choose between the horns, then from her cheek, the body is about 2 units long, including the tail. You can also see how things align perpendicularly or parallel to the floor by holding out your arm straight, same eye closed. Hold it as perpendicular to the floor as you can. Here I notice that her edge of her foot lines up with the edge of her frill, or if I hold it up parallel to the floor, I can see where the top of her body should line up in terms of her frill, in terms of a little bit on the bottom edge of her horn, and this will help me align proportions correctly. So I didn't do that at all to begin with. And you can see when I check on my drawing, the same units between the horns, I made her body 3 units long, so she got pretty elongated. When I put my pen across her back, I noticed that her head is smaller proportionally, so I'm bisecting it at a higher point on the horn and on her frill. I also added an extra point on her frill. If you can do an extra frill, you're beautiful. So frill conscious. She's beautiful how she is. But I added one. I added an extra point on her frill. Anyways, and you realize the line that it should be going through, and you can tell that it's tilted down, which means the head needed to turn away a little bit and grow. So you can see how I didn't really test that at all. Another helpful perspective layout alignment trick is to consider any line parallel to the floor that you're standing on to be 0 degrees, and using your pen to connect 2 points of the object with your arms straight. See if you can estimate and recreate that approximate angle between the pen line and the 0 degree baseline. For example, if I see how her left feet align in actuality, it is creating about a 35 degree angle from the baseline. In my drawing, I almost made the feet line up completely straight across, probably just a degree or 2 up from that baseline across the floor. In actuality, the whole body itself should be shifted away, whereas in the drawing I tilted it to a more side-facing view. These are all just helpful ways to approximate as you go if the accuracy of the perspective and the proportion are important to you in your drawing. So proportionally, this drawing is pretty wonky relative to our actual beautiful, perfect model. But I wasn't too worried about it. If I'm trying to get closer on that, I definitely use that proportion check. Use a little bit of charcoal to finish off the end value in the body. I probably could have pushed it further. I could have worked a few more hours on my tedious little stippling method, but that was my drawing. I hope this helped. Now you can go and you can find some sort of weird creature thing, or maybe you have like a beautiful Kit Kat of your own. Maybe you just want to start with simple objects because you haven't really drawn much, and that's perfectly wonderful. Grabbing an egg you found or something like just a round orb can give you good practice in developing value and creating that illusion of form that we're going for. If you're not that into drawing representational things, that's okay. That's awesome. In fact, expressive, abstract work still benefits from learning how to observe and look at things, because maybe you're inspired solely by the shadow shapes you see, and then they grow into some sort of patterning. Thinking about value in any of the compositions that you're drawing or making is important. And honestly, let's not forget just random mark making and figuring out how to play with your pens and play with your charcoal or whatever you have at the moment. And the most important thing is not worrying too much. We start to learn these tools that we rotate through in our minds to try to help our observation skills, but I'm only thinking about some of them sometimes. Some of them afterwards I'm like, oh, I didn't use that. Well, now I know. Or maybe I didn't need to. Maybe I don't care at all about creating that much depth, and it's more about breaking up the forms into this interesting interplay of shapes. Maybe that's all that I want to do. Hopefully now you can start to think about when you're observing things, be like, ooh, I see that shadow. That's the darkest part of the shadow. And so I know that the light must be coming from this direction, and that must be the part that's turning away from the light, because that's the core of the shadow. As you get better at that, you can start imagining things. You can start to create shadow on your imagined creation. They still will benefit from you having references sometimes, but you'll be able to play with that because you now have been observing all the value, and then you've also been playing with line because you're doing contour line drawing. Those things are just things you have to practice, and you can read about them and you can pay attention to the vocabulary. The vocabulary is helpful, learning to speak about your work and break it down, but really it's all about that excitement about observing the world, and you can take that back with you whenever you do want to draw something or whenever you're wanting to create or challenge yourself. So hopefully I got you excited. Hopefully you're gonna go out and get your own Triceratops, although she's like $300 on eBay, I've heard. I rescued her from a thrift store for $60. I would pay for you. I think you're worth the world. I shouldn't have spoken. You're priceless. You don't need extra frill. Really, if you're at all still intimidated, you can look back at my shape drawings. Those were my best attempts at shapes. I cannot draw a straight line. Oh well. Don't worry too much. They're gonna be shifty things. The history of the drawing is awesome. The weirdness that contour lines create. Oh my gosh. And how light hits different textures. Light hitting different textures. It's just so fun. So just feel excited about whatever you're gonna make. You're gonna do great. intermission. You open the door and something hard and go on. Nice. I know. You would have made room. We all would have made room on the door. Good point.